Well, today is December the 1st, and I hate to break it to you, but that means there are only 24 sleeps until Christmas, which feels unnervingly close to me. I was put to shame a couple of weeks ago in the cafe when one of the mums who comes regularly came in with a trolley full of wrapping paper and told me that she was on her way home that afternoon to wrap up all her Christmas presents because she had finished all of her shopping. Now, this was a few weeks ago. I'm usually still wrapping on Christmas Eve, desperately hoping I haven't forgotten anything vitally important. And I guess there'll be others of you here this morning, like Tony, who have already begun your preparations for Christmas. Perhaps you started back in the summer. Perhaps you started back in the January sales. If you did, please don't tell me, because that will only make me feel bad. But whether or not you've started your practical preparations, today is a great moment to start your spiritual preparations. I hope that some of you have signed up for the Advent readings that we're going to be journeying through together, because this morning was a reminder of hope. Today is not just the 1st of December, it's the 1st of Advent, that time we remembered as we lit our candle, a time of preparation, a time to watch, to wait, to remind ourselves that our waiting should be faithful, but it should be active for that time when Jesus comes back. But I wonder, what does it look like for us to prepare? The Christmas story is so familiar, isn't it, that we can often just let it wash over us. But how can we let this story, so familiar, shape and change the people that we are today and in this season? Our new Advent series starts today, and it's called Down to Earth. And we're going to be thinking about both elements of that title. Firstly, that we have a God who has come down to earth, a God who is still in so many ways a down-to-earth God, who has involved himself in the mess and the beauty of daily life. But secondly, we're going to be thinking about that down-to-earth God who has made the earth his mission place, and a mission place for each one of us, that we are called to be, in some senses, down-to-earth people. We're called to be heavenly minded, but to have our boots on the ground with that same down-to-earth focus that our Saviour had. And so as we prepare, let's hold those things in our mind. There'll be all sorts of family traditions that you have over Christmas. I remember that last year on one of our church family services, we sat around tables and we discussed some of the different traditions that we have in our household. And I think I told you then that we in our house have 2 big tubs of chocolates that we make sure we have. My daughter's already got them bought. They're in the cupboard ready for when we decorate the Christmas tree and the lounge. And when we decorate the Christmas tree, we always have on it candy canes because of the story that they tell, but also some little crocheted stockings that my mum knitted for us years ago, and we fill them with a little treat. Around the world, traditions vary, and apparently in Japan, it's become tradition for many people to take a trip to KFC on Christmas Day. In fact, people pre-order months in advance. Who knew? In Sweden, they celebrate sometimes the Yule goat. And apparently in Romania, it's tradition for men to dress up as goats. Who knew that goats played such an important part in the Christmas story? Yeah. But for many of us, Christmas crackers will feature on our tables. It's quite a British tradition. And I wonder if you've ever thought about why we have Christmas crackers. Maybe you thought they just made your table look a bit pretty, or it was nice to have a hat, made you feel festive. Maybe you've never thought about them at all. Well, I'd like to suggest that on your tables there at Christmas, you have a perfect visual aid to help you focus on and remember the true meaning of Christmas. Because usually a cracker contains, at the very least, a crown, a little gift, and a message, often a joke. A crown, but for what kind of king? A message, but what is the message of Christmas? A gift, but what is the gift? I hope that we'll rediscover during our Advent journey that the king that crown points to is, of course, Jesus. But that Jesus is a most unusual king who brings with him a very down-to-earth message, but a message of hope. One that is accompanied by an incredibly precious gift, the gift of a rescued life. Nathaniel read to us earlier a passage right from the start of John's Gospel. And on the face of it, it might seem that John starts his Gospel in quite a strange place. We often read it as part of our carol services, don't we? But here, as John starts his Gospel, there's no story of Jesus' birth, no Mary, no Joseph, no shepherds, no magi. There isn't even a donkey or a goat in sight. But instead, John launches into this big, huge cosmic view of who God is, of who Jesus is, the one that the angels announce, the shepherds worship, the magi come looking for in the other Gospels. Here for John, he wants to announce right from the start that this newborn king the others point to is Jesus, the Word made flesh. And so he starts his gospel in quite an unusual way. And as he does so, N.T. Wright says he does it with the full meaning of everything Jesus was and is and did. John starts with what he thinks is the most important thing that will set the scene for the rest of his gospel. And so it feels like it's a good place for us to start our Advent preparation. John introduces us to the Word, the creator, the source of all life, the one whose life brings light into the darkness of this world, the one who was there right from the beginning, the king of the entire universe. And yet, Jesus is a king like no other. His rule and his reign over this world, the world that he loves so much, is different. His kingdom is like no other, because his kingdom is one that is intended where each and every one of us will flourish. Verse 14, the very last verse that Nathaniel read to us, says this: "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." And it's this verse that I want us to focus in on today and to unpack together. And to notice three things from this that make Jesus, this king, so unusual. And the first thing is this: that this unusual king, God, becomes one of us. The Word became flesh. The image that often springs to mind when we think of a king is someone who's entitled to wear a crown, someone perhaps who is entitled to live in a palace. The crown that we saw at the coronation of King Charles III recently apparently is worth £400 million. But Jesus left the glory of his Father's presence and became flesh. We get so used to that idea that I think we miss the enormity of it. Jesus came as a king, would never live in a palace, never wear a crown of gold. Instead, he was destined to wear a crown made of thorns, a crown that wasn't worth anything, but a crown that cost him everything. And the Bible tells us that if we want to know what God is like, we need to look hard at this Jesus. Paul tells us in Philippians chapter 2, verse 7, that Jesus made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness. In the opening of John's Gospel, he tells us that Jesus was there from the very beginning, over everything, overseeing creation, speaking creation into being with his word. And yet, this Creator God becomes nothing, and he takes on flesh. Last week I went to visit Gareth, and because I only wanted to take hand luggage, I just took one tiny suitcase. So I needed to fit everything that I needed for a week, including all the boxes of Jaffa cakes that I had to take out for his colleagues, into my tiny suitcase. Thankfully, I wasn't going for that long, so I didn't have too much to put in there. But imagine if I'd been going for a month, or I don't know, for a year, perhaps even permanently. There's no way I would have fitted all my stuff, everything I own, into my tiny little hand luggage, would I? It just wouldn't be possible. And yet it's a bit like this, but on an infinitely magnified scale for Jesus. Jesus, the one who has no beginning and end, God himself, who was and is everything, confined all his glory not into my tiny hand luggage, but he limited himself and he took on flesh so that he could come down to earth and make his dwelling amongst us, his creation. And we should be blown away by the magnitude of that, but also by the humility of it. Jesus swapped the glory of heaven for the mess of earth, and he did it out of love. So Jesus, our unusual king, is a humble king. Today, we quite like and admire humility, don't we? But this wasn't the case at all in Jesus' day. And that makes him even more unusual, I think, in his time and in his place. Historians will tell you that the Roman world didn't value humility at all. It didn't consider it a virtue in any way. What was prized was honor, was having your qualities recognized, your name praised. To boast about your achievements wasn't just culturally acceptable, it was expected. And into this culture and into this context, Jesus comes, and he totally upends what is expected. He submitted himself to the most humiliating punishments the Romans could create, crucifixion. He emptied himself of all his divine status, and he died for the sake of the world that he loved. Could it be that this humble, unusual act of a king is the path to the revolution that our world needs today? Could it be that we are called to follow his example, to do the same, to empty ourselves of our self-importance and lay down our lives for the sake of others? Jesus was motivated by knowing what his Father valued and by his love for us. And I wonder, if you examine your hearts, what is it that motivates you? What drives you? We live in a world that is obsessed with self, where it's okay to be selfish or self-interested. And I wonder what it might look like for you this week to live a life that is modeled on Jesus' example. Perhaps it might mean that you need to make opportunities to look for ways to value and appreciate and care for others. Maybe it means watching your tongue, guarding what you say. Maybe it could mean fasting from some of those things that you know you do to impress others or to get noticed. Following Jesus' example will take many forms, but it is what we're called to do. Secondly, this unusual king moves into our neighborhood. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Here in the person of Jesus, we have God in human form, God expressing himself in a language that we can all understand. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Here is God becoming one with the frailty and the vulnerability of his creation, becoming one with us, becoming one of us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And that word dwelt is an interesting one. The word used in the Greek derives from the word tent or tabernacle. And it's almost as if God was saying, the verse is saying that God became human and pitched his tent right up in the middle of us. My kids would probably say we spent far too many holidays in tents, particularly ones where it's raining and the storms are blowing all around us. We've spent night times hammering back in tent pegs to stop our tents sliding away overnight. We've spent holidays huddled up inside our tent trying to keep warm and dry when everything around us is wet. So I know how vulnerable and fragile tents can be. But Jesus, the Word, became human, took on flesh, and pitched his tent among us. For so long, the Israelites had been waiting for God in a huge, solid temple, strong to the elements, invincible against the invading powers. But instead of turning up there, God pitched up, put his tent among them. Eugene Peterson's version of the Bible, the paraphrase, the Message, expresses this verse like this. He said, "The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood." When Jesus was born as a baby, he moved into the neighborhood. He came to the place where we are. Kings are used to grandeur, and yet our unusual king was born in a town so nondescript that it had to be defined, Bethlehem in Judea, to avoid confusion with other Bethlehems. Jesus lived most of his life in humble conditions, and yet, born as a baby, he moved into our neighborhood. And as a result, we learn that God isn't just a theological doctrine. God is a relationship. Jesus isn't a principle, he's a person, one who moved into our neighborhood. So we can't talk about this Jesus, the unusual king, in the abstract. He's not some story that we wheel out at Christmas for the children. Jesus moved into the neighborhood. He took up residence amongst us. The Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. Jesus subjected himself to the distresses and the disasters of everyday life. He chose to live in the same world as us, to experience the daily demands and pressures of our lives, of our towns, of our cities. The one who lived amongst the angels now lives among those who don't even recognize or accept him. And because of that connection, he knows the messiness, the realities. He knows the neighborhood. He knows the loneliness, the grieving. He knows the fears and the anxieties. He knows when we're hurting, what it's like to hurt. He knows when we're rejoicing and what it's like to rejoice. He is Emmanuel, God with us. So whatever the joys or the sorrows, whatever your hopes and fears, the Word has become flesh and dwelt among us. And we are called to live out the life of this king in our neighborhoods, to follow his example. He came to where the people are. We're called to live among the lonely and the lost, to be just like Jesus, the light of hope to the people around us. And I wonder what it might look like for you to be that person of hope, that light, in and amongst all the people that you come into contact with this week, where you live, where you work. Because each of those places, God has uniquely placed you. Nobody else has the friends that you do. Nobody else comes into contact with the people that you do. So your mission is a down-to-earth mission. You are called to be Jesus to those around you. And thirdly, this unusual king is one full of grace and truth. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. A usual king might declare edicts, might create laws, but it's very unusual for one to be known for their grace. For the Israelites, the old temple contained the laws that showed you where you'd gone wrong. But this Jesus, this unusual king, embodied grace and truth. When this king encountered a woman at the well, or a woman caught in adultery, or a money-grabbing little tax collector, or a follower who betrayed him at the last minute in his moment of need, this king told them the truth, but his grace also set them free. And so it's interesting that often when we look to God in everyday life, we look up out of our troubles, we cry out in prayer. But this passage tells us that we don't need to look up because God came to earth. He's a God who got his feet dirty, a God who became one of us, a God who dwells in our neighborhoods and is full of grace and truth. 2024 has been a year of elections, hasn't it? Globally, more voters than ever before have been to the polls. More than 80 countries have sought new leaders to govern their civic life this year. And as we voted, I wonder how many of us were asking our questions about how good these leaders would be in the issues that we face in our neighborhoods, in our country. Whether we were asking whether those leaders would guide us into a future where the next generation would flourish. Were we asking questions about their humility, their trustworthiness, whether they understood the issues that real people face. Well, Jesus, the unusual king, came to identify himself with us, not to wield power, but instead to be there for each and every one, for the least and the lowly. Jesus, this unusual king, moved into our neighborhood, not removed from the reality of everyday life, but there, present alongside us in it. Jesus, the unusual king, came to save. He came to serve and not to be served. Who wouldn't bow the knee to a king like that?
Power is social currency. Those who have this seemingly finite resource are often the last to give it up, resulting in more for them and less for us. This skewed perspective creates a frenzy in which survival of the fittest kicks into gear. And I suppose this would be appropriate if we all had access to the same resources, but we don't. At its core, a thirst for power is fueled by insecurity. Perhaps this is why we struggle to trust our leaders. Could it be that their insatiable thirst for power and their hunger for more is a result of insecurity rearing its head? It is difficult to entrust oneself to leadership these days. In many ways, the true character of a leader is determined by their relationship with power. This narrows the playing field regarding who is and isn't a good leader. To narrow the playing field even further, few leaders have taught to love one's enemies. Even fewer have taught that it is better to give than it is to receive, to repay evil with good, and to serve sacrificially for the common good. As beautiful as these principles are, they serve as mere platitudes if understood simply as moral guidance. However, if understood within the context of who it was who said and did these things, the playing field is narrowed down to one player, one leader. If this leader were a football manager, he wouldn't just simply bark instructions from the touchline. He'd immerse himself into the game, braving the cold of December nights in hostile stadiums, enduring grueling tackles from vengeful opposition, leaving his sweat and tears, but most importantly, his blood on the pitch. This leader isn't a sporting coach. This leader is our king, the king who becomes one of us. This unusual king is Jesus.
And so, for each one of us at the start of Advent, Jesus, the Word made flesh, Jesus, our unusual King, calls us to follow him in his unusual way of life. We're called to be down to earth, to be relatable, humble people. We're called to make a difference to the places where we are. We can prayerfully come before God and ask what it would look like if he ruled and reigned in the places that we live. How would that impact, I wonder, our schools, our streets, our places of work? And as we come before God and ask those questions, it's right to begin to look around and to recognize where God and his restorative mission are already outworking in your place. To recognize that he has given you a responsibility to join him in his mission, to make a difference in your world, on your front line for him. The challenge, I think, for each one of us this week and for this Advent season is to seek out how we might make a difference for Jesus. As we prepare for Christmas, let our words become flesh. Turn our love into action and attempt something unusual. Seek to bless those around you this Christmas. So I wonder, what does it look like for you to join Jesus in his down-to-earth mission this Advent?